Welcome back everybody to another episode of Direct Comparison. In today's episode, we're going to take an early look at IO Interactive's latest entry to the Hitman series, Hitman 3, and see how it compares both visually and from a gameplay perspective to the previous entry to the series, Hitman 2. Now before we get started, there's a few important things to remember. First, the build that I'm playing is from an early preview of the upcoming game, and so any irregularities, either graphical or gameplay-wise, are subject to change by the game's release later this month. Also, in order to capture the most accurate side-by-side comparisons, I will be comparing mostly sequences from older levels available in both Hitman 3 and Hitman 2. I received a large number of questions about this last time I made a Hitman comparison, so I just want to make this very clear this time. Hitman 3 is a brand new experience. It offers a new campaign, new missions, and new features. But if you own any of the previous two games, Hitman from 2016 or Hitman 2, those levels are fully playable within Hitman 3. And I will show a little bit of the new environments throughout the course of this video, including the latest Dubai mission. But again, I want to focus predominantly on the older environments for the sake of consistency. And I'll cover more of the new levels with a follow-up review in the coming weeks. For reference, both games are being played on the PC, with the settings cranked up to their highest values at a native 4K resolution. However, I will be disabling the motion blur for cleaner still images, and will leave the super sampling slider at its defaulted 100%. Alright, so let's kick this comparison off by first going over the presentation, starting with a close-up look at Agent 47 himself. Now, you may remember from a few years back, I created a similar comparison, only it was between Hitman 2 and the original game in the trilogy, Hitman 2016. In that analysis, I pointed out a few subtle changes to 47, mainly that his suit seemed to lack the same high-fidelity textures, and that his face was reworked a bit, giving him a slightly different look. It appears those same changes have been addressed once again with this latest entry, as Agent 47's suit is now sporting nice high-resolution textures again, along with added details like stitching along his lapel and a boutonniere. His tie has also been changed a little bit, appearing wider with a larger knot within a widened collar. Then there's 47's actual face. This was an interesting change as I feel they toned down the amount of detail a bit, almost making him appear younger as a result. His jawline is now more rounded, his cheeks are not quite as sunken, and the lines extending from his nostrils down to his upper lip are almost impossible to see now. What's more, it seems the developers even adjusted the coloration of 47's eyes, making them light blue as opposed to the almost purple hue that they had before. You also find that a lot of the really fine details like skin pores and the much smaller veins in his cornea are less prominent this time. And while I preferred this latter adjustment, I think I preferred the extra detail we had with the old skin texture instead. Though it's possible this may also be a result of the updates that were made to the lighting system, which I'll talk about more in a bit. Still, either way, he looks much younger in Hitman 3 than from when we last saw him, and I'm not quite sure it's necessarily an improvement. But I'm curious what you guys think about it, as it could just boil down to preference. But considering you'll probably spend more time looking at the barcode on the back of his head than his actual face, let's move on and talk about the game's environment instead. Now, as I mentioned before, Hitman 3 includes a slew of new environments to explore, all complete with tons of unique assassination opportunities and infiltration methods that will surely keep completionists busy for a good while. But what's great about this series lately is that, in order to keep the world of assassination connected, IO Interactive has allowed players who own the previous two games to replay levels directly in the latest game. Now, at first glance, these levels are virtually identical, but I did run into a few interesting changes that have been made, that are likely the result of the updates IO Interactive have been making to their Glacier engine. First off, there's the image sharpening. Back in 2019, AMD added their new Fidelity FX sharpening to Hitman 2, which, according to the description in the game's settings, helps to counter the effects caused by temporal anti-aliasing. And as you can see with some of these samples here, the difference is pretty obvious. This plaque looks much blurrier in Hitman 3, as it currently does not offer this same sharpening option in its graphics menu. This is especially noticeable when looking at the trees in the suburbs level, with all the yellow leaves blending together more than they ever did before. Now, that being said, the actual texture maps themselves, including this plaque, are identical between games. I looked at several different surfaces in many of the different levels, and everything appears with that same great quality. And I was often surprised by just how detailed tiny objects in the environment are, like this newspaper that has actual legible print on it. The only flaw that I could find was this one distant skyscraper in Miami, that, for whatever reason, looks like its textures didn't load in properly. with a flat, blurry surface as opposed to the nicely detailed windows from before. The building next to it looks identical though, so I'm convinced that this is probably just a minor map loading error rather than an intentional change. Moving on, we have the lighting design. Now, when I first started testing this game's lighting, I had trouble finding anything that really looked all that different. The coloration of every level remains identical, and that same, often excessive bloom effect still presents itself in all the same places. But I was surprised to find that one of Hitman 3's biggest technical improvements actually comes from its newly expanded screen space reflections. Now, Hitman 2 did feature screen space reflections, especially with its larger bodies of water. But in Hitman 3, the reflections can be found everywhere. From the marbled floors of this lounge area in Paris, to the small neon-lit staircase in Miami. All surfaces that should be reflective now offer at least some form of screen space reflections. And while they're not the same as the ray trace reflections that have become so increasingly popular with the new consoles, it still adds a great deal to a lot of these scenes. What's more, other reflections in the game, like the great mirrors introduced in Hitman 3, have been improved further, with a higher resolution image to make the effect more convincing. Another big improvement has been made to the God Ray implementation. While not quite as noticeable as the reflections, due to only a few maps offering the lighting conditions for it to appear, the God Rays in Hitman 3 are much more impressive, with smaller but more numerous rays of light pouring in through tree leaves and the windows in the side room. It almost looks broken in Hitman 2, and the ambient lighting in the room itself also feels a great deal different. Next up, we have shadows. Now, this aspect is a bit more challenging to judge. The shadow projections were already pretty decent in Hitman 2. And from my observations here, they don't seem to have changed at all. The edges of 47 Shadow are nicely rounded with a little bit of edge shimmer that's barely noticeable. And all the environmental shadows, even the shadows cast by birds flying above, still behave in exactly the same way. However, for some reason, the shadows cast by the 3D grass objects around some of the environments, like this patch of grass in Miami, are now practically non-existent in Hitman 3, making the patch of grass feel a little bit less dense as a result. Then of course we have our effects. For the most part, the effects remain nearly the same between games. The fire effects have been improved slightly, and the explosions have been modified to feature this new bright flashing bloom effect, rather than the large plume of smoke like before. But otherwise, a lot of these effects look about the same. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing either. The effects in Hitman 2 were pretty good, especially the water simulation. All the rolling waves and beautiful water fountains have been carried over directly, and have even been incorporated into the newer levels as well. Dubai, for example, has this fantastic upper walkway that not only shows off the updated screen space reflections, but also has this great high-quality splashing effect when Agent 47 runs through it. The very same effect that can be observed in Hitman 2 when walking through shallow puddles. Then there's of course the crowds. That continue to be some of the more impressive-looking crowds in the industry, with enough distinct character variety to never fully break the illusion. All these NPCs have been carried over exactly the same from the last game, as their placement is paramount to how players play each level. And from the few samples that I've taken, it doesn't seem that very many of them have changed visually either. Next up, let's talk briefly about the gameplay mechanics. Now, unfortunately, I've only been able to play and share this first new level for you, which admittedly doesn't offer very many new gameplay mechanics over levels in Hitman 2. But there's still a few that are worth mentioning that I feel will likely become even more apparent in the final release later this month. First off, there's the new intro sequences. According to IO Interactive, levels will now offer more cinematic intro sequences to help add a bit more intensity to the game's climactic narrative. In the Dubai mission, for example, you'll start off at the edge of a building in a special getup, and need to carefully climb around the building's exterior before smoothly sneaking inside and blending into the crowd. It's a cool way to start off a new level, and thankfully, once you've done it the first time, it becomes entirely optional, as a new start location is added that drops you off right at the end of the scripted sequence. Next, there's the new gadget, the camera. This plays a pretty decent role in the game now, as it can not only be used to snap photos of objectives, like neutralized targets, but it can also be used to remotely hack objects in the environment. In Dubai, for example, you can use the camera to open up electronic window panels, allowing you to travel back outside and even create distractions to help bypass patrols. I haven't found much more use for it other than that so far, but I imagine since it's a permanent part of 47's inventory now, that it'll likely have more application when the final game releases. Then of course, there's the new persistent shortcuts. These are things that players can interact with in the environment that will unlock new access routes and paths on repeat playthroughs. This I think is a really nice touch, as it was always tedious trying to replay levels to earn additional gear and achievements, only to take the long, repetitive path to reach the same objective areas. But now, things like these ladders should alleviate some of that headache, and make it more fun to experiment with new ways to take down your targets. There's a few other features in Hitman 3 as well, including new tools of the trade and new features in the menus, but I'll go over those later this month when I get my hands on the final game. Finally, let's wrap up with a brief sound comparison. Which game do you think has the better audio quality and design?
Step right in, sir. Enjoy your evening.
There he is. That's the owner of St. Louis, right there.
Good evening, sir. Welcome to Sanguine.
There he is. That's Novacop, the owner of St. Louis, right there. Congressman, a pleasure as always.
Now the key here is tire management. I mean, if you're not careful, you can burn these tires off after 10 laps. It's a huge deal to manage that in this heat, and these drivers know it. About which team can go the distance. Fuel efficiency and reliability. That's the name of the game. This is where you see the car technology of tomorrow.
Next up, Robert Knox. Target down. Next up, Robert Knox.
And that wraps up this episode of Direct Comparison. Overall, Hitman 3 offers quite a few subtle changes under the hood that are really hard to pick up on if you're not comparing the games side by side. Things like Agent 47's facial design, his clothing, and other enhancements like AMD sharpening are all incredibly minor changes that are easy to dismiss as you play through the game. But there are a few effects that stand out a great deal, especially the updates to the lighting and screen space reflections that do a great job of enhancing some already beautiful environmental designs. There's also a number of brand new environments to explore, along with the epic conclusion to this strong comeback to the Hitman series. I've been a big fan of the series for a while now, and while I have a special place in my heart for the likes of Hitman Contracts and Blood Money, Hitman 3 is looking to be the ultimate modern Hitman experience, with arguably the best looking visuals, most robust selection of levels, and tons of great new gameplay features to assist in executing the perfect kill. Hitman 3 will be releasing January 20th for the PC, Xbox Series X, PlayStation 5, previous gen consoles, and even the Nintendo Switch. And if you happen to have the PlayStation VR device, you can even experience the world of Assassination completely in VR, which should be fairly interesting. I want to thank IO Interactive for allowing me to try out the game early, and if you want to learn more about Hitman 3, be sure to stay tuned for a full review around the game's release in a few weeks. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this posted every week.